The desert wind cut across Camp Prescott like a serrated blade carrying with it the scent of dust, sweat, and something else, something darker. Anticipation, maybe, or violence waiting to be born. It was the second week of the Special Operations Integration Program, a 12-week crucible designed to break bodies and forge warriors from whatever remained. The kind of place where weakness got exposed under the Arizona sun like bone through torn flesh, where the strong survived and the weak went home in shame, their dreams of military glory reduced to stories they'd never tell at bars. Sergeant Elena Cross didn't look like she belonged there. At 22 years old, she moved across the training compound with the kind of quietness that made people forget she was there. 5'6", 130 pounds, soaking wet with dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun that seemed too tight for her delicate features. She kept her eyes down when officers passed, kept her voice soft when forced to speak, kept to herself during meals while the others bonded over shared misery and dark humor. She looked to anyone watching like prey, and there were three people watching who thought exactly that. Lieutenant Marcus Crane stood 6'2", with the kind of build that came from expensive gym memberships and personal trainers. His jawline could have been carved from granite, his posture military perfect, his uniform pressed with creases sharp enough to draw blood. At 24, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. The son of Senator William Crane Marcus had grown up in Washington, D.C. penthouses and summer homes in Martha's Vineyard where power was inherited like eye color, and destiny was something you purchased with the right last name. He watched Elena fumble with her rifle during morning drills and smiled the way a wolf smiles at a limping deer. Beside him, Corporal Jax Hunter cracked his knuckles with unnecessary force. 23 years old, built like a middleweight fighter who'd skipped leg day, Hunter had something to prove to everyone, including himself. He came from nothing, grew up in a Rust Belt town where the factory closed when he was 12 and his father started drinking when he was 13. The military was supposed to be his escape, his chance to become someone who mattered. But the chip on his shoulder weighed heavier than his pack, and he compensated for every childhood humiliation by making sure someone else hurt more than he did. He saw Elena's quiet demeanor and mistook it for the same weakness that had gotten him beaten up behind the school gymnasium a decade ago. The third member of their trio was perhaps the cruelest because she should have known better. Sergeant Kayla Voss, 25, had fought her way into military respect through sheer brutality. She'd learned early that the only way to survive as a woman in combat culture was to be harder, meaner, and more vicious than any man in the room. She'd earned her place by breaking the rules everyone pretended didn't exist anymore, by proving she could outshoot, outfight, and out-intimidate her male counterparts. But somewhere along the way, she'd internalized the very toxicity she'd fought against. She'd become the thing that had tried to destroy her, and now she wielded that poison against other women like a weapon of righteous judgment. She looked at Elena and saw everything she'd forced herself to stop being: soft, hesitant, vulnerable. It made her furious. The three of them had formed an alliance during the first week, the kind of predatory pack that emerges naturally in environments where dominance determines survival. They weren't friends exactly, more like accomplices in the shared project of establishing who belonged and who didn't. And Elena Cross, in their collective estimation, definitely didn't belong. What none of them knew was that every morning at 0400, while they were still dreaming of glory and violence, Elena was already awake, running, 12 miles through the desert. Darkness, her breathing controlled her pace, measured her mind, cataloging every detail of the previous day's interactions. What none of them knew was that before she'd arrived at Camp Prescott, she'd spent 3 years under the direct instruction of one of the most feared operators in naval special warfare history. What none of them knew was that Master Chief Roland Webb was watching from the observation tower, his weathered face expressionless as he tracked Elena's movements with the precision of a man who'd spent 30 years identifying threats before they materialized. Webb was 48 years old with silver threading through close-cropped black hair and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't want to. His hands were scarred from rope burns and broken bones that had healed wrong. His body carried the map of 2 decades in combat zones, from Mogadishu to Fallujah to places whose names remain classified. He'd been a SEAL operator, then a SEAL instructor, then something else entirely, something they didn't put on recruiting posters. He'd arrived at Camp Prescott 3 days ago as a guest evaluator for Special Warfare Command, his presence enough to make even the most arrogant officers straighten their spines and check their language. Everyone knew his reputation. Everyone knew the stories. The mission in Yemen, the hostage extraction in Syria, the black operation in Moldova that officially never happened. No one knew that 19 years ago he'd pulled a young SEAL operator named David Cross out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar. No one knew that David Cross had become his swim buddy, his brother, his closest friend, in a world where trust was currency more valuable than gold. No one knew that 3 years ago, Webb had stood in dress blues at Arlington National Cemetery watching them fold an American flag into a triangle and hand it to a 19-year-old girl whose father had just been buried with full military honors. No one knew that he'd approached that girl afterward in the cold November rain and said words that would change both their lives forever. Your father was the best operator I ever served with. If you want to honor his memory, I'll train you. But I won't go easy on you, and I won't let you quit. Elena had looked up at him with eyes reddened from crying, but still fierce, still burning with something that couldn't be extinguished by grief, and said one word: good. Now, 3 years later, Webb watched her navigate the social dynamics of Camp Prescott with the same strategic patience her father had demonstrated on operations. She was playing a role, projecting weakness, inviting predators to reveal themselves so they could be dealt with permanently. She was bait, and the fish were biting. On the fourth day of her second week, the harassment began in earnest. Elena arrived at morning formation to find her locker had been forced open. Her gear scattered across the barracks floor. Her boots were missing. Her canteen had been filled with sand. Her name tag had been ripped off her uniform and replaced with a handwritten note that said one word: quit. She gathered her belongings without expression, found her boots in the latrine, cleaned them methodically, replaced her name tag with a spare, showed up to formation 2 minutes early, her face composed, her posture correct. Crane watched her with amusement. Hunter laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. Voss smiled coldly and said nothing. The other recruits looked away, complicit in their silence. That afternoon during obstacle course training, Elena was halfway up the rope climb when someone cut her support line. She fell 12 feet, landing hard on the packed dirt, the impact driving the air from her lungs in an audible gasp. The supervising instructor, a captain named Morrison, who'd been looking the other way at just the right moment, jogged over with performative concern. "You okay, Cross?" Elena pulled herself to her feet, ignoring the screaming pain in her left shoulder where she'd absorbed most of the impact. "Yes, sir. You need to be more careful. These exercises are dangerous if you're not paying attention." "Yes, sir." She got back in line, climbed the rope again, made it to the top despite the grinding agony in her shoulder joint, descended properly, moved to the next obstacle. Webb watched from the observation platform, his jaw tight but his expression neutral. Beside him, Colonel Sarah Hendricks, the camp commander, shifted uncomfortably. "This is worse than the preliminary report suggested," she said quietly. "Much worse," Webb agreed. "She's documenting systematic failure at every level, 47 incidents in 10 days. Should we intervene now?" "Not yet. She needs irrefutable evidence before we move. If we stop it too early, they'll claim it was isolated incidents." Hendricks nodded grimly. "And if we wait too long—" "I won't let it go too long," Webb said. His voice carried absolute certainty. "I'm watching." Elena Cross wasn't just enduring harassment. She was documenting it. Every morning at 04:30 before her run, she opened a small leather journal she kept hidden in the false bottom of her footlocker. She wrote with precise handwriting, logging every incident with timestamps, witnesses, and factual descriptions devoid of emotion. Day 8, 0600 hours. Locker forced open gear sabotaged. Witnesses, recruits, Patterson, Lou Kowalski, all looked away when questioned. Day 8, 1400 hours. Support line cut during rope climb. Fell approximately 12 feet. Supervising officer Captain Morrison present, but claimed to be checking roster. Note cut was clean, not frayed. Deliberate sabotage. Day 9, 1200 hours, approached during lunch by Sergeant Voss. Quote, "Maybe you should reconsider whether you belong here. Save yourself the embarrassment. No physical contact, but clear intimidation." Day 10, morning formation. Lieutenant Crane made audible comment during inspection. Quote, "Cross looks like she's about to cry. Maybe we should get her a tissue in a safe space." Laughter from Hunter and Voss. Other recruits silent. 47 documented incidents over 10 days. 12 witnesses who'd remained silent. 4 supervising officers who'd looked the other way. One program that had failed every standard it claimed to uphold. Elena wrote it all down with the methodical precision her father had taught her during childhood camping trips when he'd shown her how to read terrain track game and identify threats before they became deadly. Strategic patience, he'd called it, the ability to endure discomfort in service of a larger objective. Warriors don't react, he'd told her when she was 14, teaching her chess on their back porch while cicadas sang in the Louisiana heat. They respond. There's a difference. Reaction is emotion. Response is strategy. She'd remembered those words when the Marines had knocked on their door 3 years later, with news that would shatter her world into before and after. She remembered them now as Marcus Crane cornered her outside the mess hall on the 11th night. It was after 2,200 hours, technically past curfew, but Elena had been reviewing training manuals in the library. She was walking back to the barracks alone, her path lit by security lights that created more shadows than illumination, when Crane stepped out from between 2 buildings with Hunter and Voss flanking him like sentries. Elena stopped walking, calculated distances, noted exits, kept her expression neutral. Working late cross, Crane's voice carried false friendliness, the kind that meant violence was coming. That's dedication, or maybe desperation. Just studying, sir. Her voice was soft, non-threatening. That's the problem, though, isn't it? Crane took a step closer. You can study all you want, read every manual, memorize every protocol, but some people just don't have what it takes, and no amount of studying changes biology. Hunter cracked his knuckles again, a nervous tick disguised as intimidation. Maybe you should quit now, Cross. Before you get hurt. Training accidents happen all the time. Voss said nothing, just watched with cold assessment, her arms crossed over her chest. Elena met Crane's eyes directly for the first time since arriving at Camp Prescott, held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to show she wasn't afraid, not long enough to be insubordinate. I'm not quitting, sir. Something flickered across Crane's face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation that his prey wasn't running. Your funeral, he said finally, but don't say we didn't warn you. They walked away, their laughter echoing across the compound. Elena waited until they were out of sight, then pulled out her journal and wrote with hands that didn't shake. Day 11, 22:15, hours confronted by Lieutenant Crane, C. Plupper, Hunter Sergeant Voss outside library. Direct threat made by Hunter. Quote, training accidents happen all the time. Interpreted as threat of physical harm. No witnesses, reported to no one. She closed the journal, went back to her bunk, lay awake in the darkness listening to the breathing of 30 other recruits who'd learned that silence was safer than solidarity. And she waited, because warriors don't react, they respond. And her response was coming. In the observation tower, Roland Webb reviewed his own notes by lamplight. He'd been documenting the same incidents from a different angle, building a parallel case file that would support Elena's testimony when the time came. He knew what she was doing, knew what it cost her to endure harassment without fighting back, when every instinct trained into her over 3 years of brutal conditioning screamed to neutralize threats immediately. He also knew something Elena didn't yet fully understand about herself. She wasn't her father's daughter just because of genetics. She was his daughter because she'd inherited his greatest strength. The ability to see the battlefield not as it appeared but as it actually was. To identify not just the immediate threat, but the system that enabled it. To strike not just at symptoms, but at causes. David Cross had died because toxic leadership had sent his unit into an ambush based on faulty intelligence that no one had questioned because questioning authority was discouraged. He died because ego had been valued over analysis, because hierarchy had trumped wisdom. Elena was making sure no one else died that way, even if it meant letting herself be hurt first. Webb understood that calculus, respected it, hated it, but wouldn't interfere. Not yet. The 12th day dawned hot and still, the kind of desert morning where heat rises in visible waves and the air feels solid enough to touch. The training schedule listed hand-to-hand combat drills, standard one-on-one matches in the practice circle with padded suits and training weapons. Elena knew what was coming before they announced the pairings. She'd been watching Crane for 12 days, had seen him talking with the supervising instructors, had noticed the way they deferred to him despite his lower rank, the privilege of his last name, bending military protocol like gravity bends light. When her name was called, she stepped forward without hesitation. When Crane stepped into the circle opposite her, she showed no surprise. When Hunter and Voss joined him, forming a triangle around her, she simply adjusted her stance to track all three simultaneously. The crowd of watching recruits went silent. This wasn't standard procedure. Everyone knew it. Everyone also knew that no one was going to stop it. Captain Morrison, supervising the drill, opened his mouth to object. But before he could speak, a voice cut across the training field with the authority of artillery fire. Let it proceed. Master Chief Roland Webb stood at the edge of the circle, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed but ready. Every eye turned toward him. Even Crane hesitated. Chief Morrison stammered, "The drill parameters specify one-on-one engagement. This is irregular." "This is evaluation," Webb said flatly. "Sergeant Cross is here to be tested. Let's test her." Elena's eyes found his for a fraction of a second. No emotion, no signal, just acknowledgement. She understood. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since the day her father died. Since the day Webb had promised to train her. Since every 4 a.m. run, and every bruised rib, and every time she'd been knocked down and gotten back up, because warriors don't quit, they adapt. This was her test, not of her combat skills. She'd proven those 1,000 times in training rooms and simulation exercises where Webb had thrown everything at her, including scenarios designed to break SEAL candidates. This was a test of her restraint, her ability to absorb punishment, to endure, to let predators reveal themselves completely before striking back. "You sure about this, Cross?" Crane asked with theatrical concern. 3 against 1 seems unfair." Elena's response was quiet enough that only those in the immediate circle heard it. "For you," she said. Then Crane charged. He came in fast, using his size advantage, aiming to grab and pin her quickly before she could establish defensive positioning. Hunter circled left while Voss moved right, classic pack tactics designed to overwhelm through coordinated assault. Elena did something that shocked everyone watching. She didn't fight back. Crane got his hands on her shoulders and drove her backward. She let him, controlled her fall but didn't resist it. Hit the mat with Crane on top, his weight crushing down. Hunter moved in, grabbing her left arm and twisting it behind her back. Voss dropped a knee into her midsection, driving the air from her lungs. The crowd gasped. Some recruits looked away. Others watched with the horrified fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Elena absorbed the pain, cataloged it, stored it away in the same mental space where she kept every other hurt she'd endured since her father died. But she also did something none of them expected. She started counting. Crane's grip on her shoulders followed a predictable pattern. Squeeze, adjust, every 4 seconds. Hunter's arm twist was aggressive but sloppy. He was putting maximum force into the hold, which meant he was off balance. His weight distribution was forward, his left leg extended. Voss's knee strike was powerful but repetitive. Same target, same angle, same rhythm. Predictable. Elena counted to 90. 90 seconds of controlled breathing while they hit her. While Crane drove an elbow into her shoulder, while Hunter wrenched her wrist, while Voss delivered body blows that would leave bruises for weeks. 90 seconds while she mapped their movements like her father had taught her to map terrain. 90 seconds while Webb watched with a face carved from stone, trusting her, believing in her, knowing what she was capable of, even as everyone else thought she was being destroyed. Then Crane made his critical mistake. He reached for the training knife on his belt, raised it high in a theatrical gesture meant to signal his complete dominance, prepared to bring it down in a mock finishing strike that violated every safety protocol in the training manual. The instant the knife reached its apex, Elena moved. Not like someone who'd been overwhelmed, not like someone desperate or afraid or broken. She moved like water turning to ice, like potential energy converting to kinetic, like a coiled spring released after being compressed to its maximum tension. Her left hand, which Crane thought was pinned, shot upward with surgical precision, caught his descending wrist in a grip that compressed nerve clusters and paralyzed his fingers. The training knife clattered to the mat. In the same fluid motion, she rolled her hips, used Crane's own weight against him, executed a perfect bridge and roll that sent him sprawling. Hunter, still holding her other arm, suddenly found himself off balance as Elena pivoted beneath him. She drove her right elbow backward into his solar plexus with exactly enough force to collapse his diaphragm without causing permanent damage. He released her arm and staggered backward, gasping. Voss tried to press her advantage, but Elena was already moving, rising, spinning inside Voss's guard, executing a modified rear naked choke that cut blood flow to the brain without damaging the windpipe. A SEAL technique. Precise. Controlled. Completely illegal in standard combat training. Voss's eyes went wide with shock, then fluttered closed as consciousness faded. Elena lowered her gently to the mat, already moving toward Crane, who was scrambling to his feet with murder in his eyes. He charged again, telegraphed his intention with shoulder positioning and weight shift. Might as well have painted a target on his center mass. Elena waited until he was 3 feet away. Then she stepped inside his reach, hooked his leading arm, used his momentum to execute a hip throw that sent him crashing to the mat so hard the impact echoed across the training field. Total elapsed time from the moment Crane reached for the knife to the moment all 3 attackers were neutralized, 4.7 seconds. The training field fell silent. Elena stood in the center of the circle, breathing controlled posture, ready, her eyes tracking potential threats even though the fight was clearly finished. Her face showed no triumph, no anger, just focused calm. Webb stepped forward, his voice carrying across the field like a bell. Freeze! Everyone holds position. Recruits froze mid-conversation. Officers stopped moving toward the circle. Even the wind seemed to pause. Webb walked slowly into the center of the mat, his boots echoing with each step. He stopped beside Elena, looked down at the 3 people who moments ago had thought they were predators, and spoke with the kind of cold certainty that ends arguments before they begin. Sergeant Elena Cross, 6 years of specialized close-quarters combat training under my direct instruction. Daughter of SEAL Team 6 operator, Lieutenant David Cross, killed in action, Afghanistan 2022. Graduated top of her class in advanced tactical operations. Qualified expert marksman with 5 weapon systems. And as of 3 weeks ago, designated federal evaluator for Special Warfare Command's Integration Program Assessment. He paused, let that information sink in, while 40 recruits processed what they just witnessed. You 3, he continued, his voice dropping to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Just committed felony assault on a federal investigator conducting an official evaluation. Marcus Crane stared up from the mat, his face cycling through shock denial and finally terrible understanding. Jax Hunter was still trying to breathe properly, his hands on his knees, his world collapsing around him. Kayla Voss, conscious again but disoriented, looked at Elena with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear, or might have been the sudden realization that everything she thought she knew had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Webb pulled out his radio. Command, this is Master Chief Webb. I need MPs to the training field immediately. 3 personnel to be placed under arrest pending court-martial proceedings. Charges include assault violation of training protocols, conspiracy to harm a federal investigator, and conduct unbecoming. The radio crackled. Copy that, Chief. MPs en route, ETA 2 minutes. Webb returned the radio to his belt, looked at Elena, allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. You held back. It wasn't a question. They're not enemies, Elena said quietly. Just people who made bad choices. You did good, better than I expected. Thank you, Chief. He shook his head slightly. Thank you for not killing them. Would have been a lot of paperwork. Despite everything, despite the pain radiating through her shoulder and ribs, despite the shocked faces surrounding her, Elena allowed herself a small smile. Then she turned to face the assembled recruits. 40 faces staring at her like she'd just transformed from prey to apex predator before their eyes. Anyone else want to test whether I belong here? She asked, her voice carrying clearly across the field. No one answered. No one even looked directly at her. They'd learned in 4.7 seconds a lesson that would reshape how every single one of them thought about strength and weakness for the rest of their military careers. The quiet ones aren't weak. They're just waiting for you to reveal who you really are. And by the time they respond, it's already too late. The military police arrived in less than 90 seconds, their vehicle kicking up dust as it skidded to a stop at the edge of the training field. 2 MPs emerged, their faces professionally neutral as they surveyed the scene. Master Chief Webb met them halfway, exchanging words too quiet for the assembled recruits to hear. Within minutes, Marcus Crane, Jax Hunter, and Kayla Voss were being escorted toward the detention facility, their hands secured behind their backs, their military careers effectively over before they'd truly begun. Elena watched them go without expression. Her shoulder throbbed where she'd absorbed Crane's elbow strike. Her ribs ached where Voss had driven repeated knees into her midsection. But pain was just information her father had taught her. Data about what your body had endured and what it could still accomplish despite damage. She'd endured worse during training sessions with Webb when he'd brought in active SEAL operators to test her limits. When they'd thrown her into scenario after scenario designed to break her concentration, her resolve, her ability to think strategically under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress. This had been mild by comparison. What hadn't been mild was the cost of restraint. The discipline required to absorb 90 seconds of assault without retaliating immediately. Every instinct Webb had drilled into her screamed to neutralize threats the moment they materialized. But this mission had required something harder than immediate violence. It had required patience as a weapon. The crowd began to disperse, slowly recruits moving toward their next scheduled training rotation, with the kind of shell-shocked silence that follows paradigm shifts. They'd watched someone they dismissed as weak reveal herself as possibly the most dangerous person on base. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces. Captain Morrison approached Webb and Elena, his expression carefully controlled, but his discomfort obvious in the tension around his eyes. "Chief, I should have intervened sooner. The 3-on-1 configuration violated standard protocol." "Yes," Webb said flatly. "It did." Morrison shifted his weight, understanding that agreement wasn't forgiveness. "I'll file a full incident report." "You'll do more than that, Captain." Webb's voice carried the weight of 3 decades teaching young officers what leadership actually meant. "You'll explain to Colonel Hendricks why you allowed systematic harassment of a federal evaluator to continue for 12 days. You'll explain why you were conveniently looking away when support lines were cut and gear was sabotaged. And you'll explain why your first instinct was to question my judgment rather than enforce your own regulations." Morrison's face went pale. "Chief, I wasn't aware that Sergeant Cross was an evaluator. If I had known..." "That's the problem." Elena spoke for the first time since the MPs had departed, her voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "You should have intervened regardless of who I was, because the behavior was wrong. Not because I had special status, but because it violated every principle this program claims to teach." Morrison had no response to that. He nodded stiffly and walked away, his career trajectory suddenly much less certain than it had been 20 minutes ago. Webb waited until Morrison was out of earshot, then turned to Elena with an expression that might have been pride, or might have been concern, or might have been both. "Medical tent. Get that shoulder examined." "It's fine, Chief." "That wasn't a request, Sergeant." Elena recognized the tone, the one that meant he was worried despite his controlled exterior, the one her father had used when she'd pushed herself too hard during their training sessions in the Louisiana woods, young and determined to prove she could handle anything he could. "Yes, Chief." She walked toward the medical facility, aware of eyes tracking her movement across the compound. By sunset, everyone on base would know what had happened. By tomorrow, the story would have spread to every military installation in the Southwest. By next week, it would be legend-shaped and reshaped by each retelling until the truth was buried under layers of embellishment. But the documented facts would remain in her journal and in Webb's parallel case file. 47 incidents, 12 silent witnesses, 4 complicit officers, one system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt from its foundation. The medical examination revealed deep tissue bruising along her left shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and extensive soft tissue damage that would heal but would hurt like hell for the next 2 weeks. The base physician, a graying colonel named Patterson, who'd seen his share of training injuries, looked at her x-rays with professional assessment. "You're lucky nothing's broken. Could have been much worse." "Yes, sir." "You want something for the pain?" Elena considered, then shook her head. "No, sir, I need to stay clear-headed." Patterson studied her for a long moment, then nodded with understanding. "I'll note in your file that you declined pain management. For what it's worth, Sergeant, I've been practicing military medicine for 26 years. I've seen a lot of training accidents. What happened to you wasn't an accident. No, sir, it wasn't. Good luck with whatever comes next. Thank you, sir. She left the medical facility as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and blood. Her body hurt, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the next moves in a game that had just escalated beyond simple harassment into federal crimes with career-ending consequences. Webb was waiting outside her barracks when she returned. He didn't speak immediately, just fell into step beside her as they walked toward the eastern perimeter where the training compound gave way to open desert. They stopped at the fence line, watching the last light fade from the sky while the temperature dropped with the sudden brutality that only desert environments deliver. You documented everything, Webb said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Chief. 47 incidents over 12 days. Times, dates, witnesses, supervising officers present. All in writing. Good. Colonel Hendricks wants to see us both at 0700 tomorrow. She's convening an emergency review board. Elena nodded. This was expected. Standard procedure when federal evaluators filed official reports that implicated multiple personnel in systemic failures. They'll try to contain it, she said quietly. Make it about 3 bad actors instead of acknowledging the cultural rot underneath. Probably. Webb's voice was neutral, but Elena had learned over 3 years to read the micro-expressions that betrayed his thoughts. The slight tightness around his eyes meant he was angry. The set of his jaw meant he was preparing for a fight. That's why you're going to give them no choice but to acknowledge the whole truth. How? Webb pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket, the kind investigators use for official testimony. Tomorrow morning before the review board, you're going to record a complete statement. Every incident, every witness who stayed silent, every officer who looked away. Every systemic failure that enabled 3 people to believe they could assault a fellow service member without consequences. He handed her the recorder. Make them understand that this isn't about you being an evaluator. It's about what happened being wrong regardless of who the victim was. Make them understand that if they try to make this go away quietly, you'll take it public. To the Inspector General, to Congress, and to whatever journalist wins the Pulitzer for exposing military training culture. Elena took the recorder, feeling its weight in her hand. This was the weapon that would do more damage than any combat technique. Documentation. Truth. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed or spun or buried under bureaucratic language in official investigations that concluded with nobody actually being held accountable. My father tried this, she said softly, tried to report toxic leadership. They ignored him, sent his unit into an ambush anyway. I know. Webb's voice carried old pain, old guilt. I was deployed when it happened. Didn't know he'd file complaints until after his funeral. If I'd known, if I'd been there to support him. He stopped, let the unfinished sentence hang in the cooling air. Elena understood what he wasn't saying, that he blamed himself for not protecting his swim buddy, that training her was both honor and penance, that he needed her to succeed where her father had failed, not just for justice, but for redemption. We finish what he started, she said. Together, Webb confirmed. They stood in silence for another moment, then walked back toward the barracks as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. That night, Elena sat at the small desk in the corner of her assigned quarters and opened her journal for what she knew would be the final entry. Not because the mission was over, but because what came next required official documentation, not personal notes. She wrote carefully, her handwriting precise despite the ache in her shoulder. Day 12, 14:30 hours, 3-on-1 assault during combat training. Sustained injuries including cracked ribs and soft tissue damage. Assault continued for approximately 90 seconds before I neutralized on all 3 attackers using SEAL close quarters combat techniques. Time elapsed 4.7 seconds. Master Chief Webb revealed my status as federal evaluator. Lieutenant Crane Seeplau Hunter. Sergeant Voss arrested and detained pending court-martial. Conclusion. Systematic harassment documented over 12 days represents complete failure of program integrity. Toxic culture enabled by silent witnesses and complicit officers creates an environment where assault becomes inevitable rather than exceptional. Recommend immediate program suspension and comprehensive reform. She closed the journal. Tomorrow she would translate these notes into official testimony. Tomorrow, she would give Colonel Hendricks and the review board no choice but to acknowledge that Camp Prescott had failed every standard it claimed to uphold. Tomorrow, she would honor her father's memory by doing what he'd tried to do and paid for with his life. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been grief, or might have been the complex mixture of both that comes from winning battles that shouldn't have needed to be fought. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes the desert beautiful before the heat becomes unbearable. Elena stood outside Colonel Hendrick's office at 0650. Her uniform pressed her posture correct, Webb beside her like a silent monument to everything she was fighting for. At precisely 0700, the door opened. Colonel Sarah Hendricks was 52 years old with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to training command. She'd earned her position through competence and careful political navigation, and Elena could see the calculations running behind her professional expression as they entered her office. Also present were three other officers, Captain Morrison looking like he'd slept poorly, Major Richard Torres, the judge advocate, general representative who would oversee any court-martial proceedings, and Lieutenant Colonel Frank Ashford, the Inspector General liaison whose presence meant this had already escalated beyond local containment. Hendricks gestured to chairs. Elena and Webb remained standing. At ease, Hendricks said. This is an informal, preliminary discussion before the official review board convenes this afternoon. With respect, Colonel, Webb said, there's nothing informal about federal crimes. Hendricks' expression tightened slightly. Agreed, indeed. Which is why we need to understand the full scope of what occurred before proceeding. Sergeant Cross, I've read your preliminary report. 47 documented incidents over 12 days. That's a serious allegation of systemic failure. It's not an allegation, ma'am. Elena's voice was steady. It's a fact. I have timestamps, witnesses, and in several cases, physical evidence. Master Chief Webb has parallel documentation from his observations as guest evaluator. Major Torres leaned forward. The three personnel in custody are claiming they didn't know you were an evaluator, that they believed they were engaging in standard hazing that, while inappropriate, wasn't intended as assault on a federal officer. Elena had expected this, the legal maneuvering to reduce charges to frame it as a misunderstanding rather than systematic abuse. That's irrelevant, sir. What they did was wrong regardless of who I was. If I'd been a standard recruit, their actions would still constitute assault, harassment, and violation of training protocols. My status as an evaluator doesn't change the nature of their crimes. It just changes the legal consequences. She pulled out her journal, placed it on Hendrick's desk. Everything's documented here. But more importantly, there are 12 other recruits who witnessed these incidents and said nothing because they've been conditioned to believe that silence is safer than solidarity. There are 4 supervising officers who looked away because intervening would have required them to acknowledge that their program has cultural problems. This isn't about 3 bad actors. It's about a system that enabled them. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford, who'd been silent until now, spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd investigated too many similar situations. Sergeant Cross, what outcome are you seeking? Because I need to be clear. If this goes to full court-martial with all charges, it will attract significant media attention. The political ramifications for this program for Special Warfare Command, potentially for military training, culture across all branches, will be substantial. Elena met his eyes directly. I'm seeking justice, sir, not just for me, but for every person who's been harassed, abused, or driven out of military service by toxic culture that prioritizes dominance over discipline. I'm seeking accountability for the officers who enabled this behavior through their silence. And I'm seeking reform that ensures no one else has to endure what I documented in this journal. That's a tall order, Sergeant. Yes, sir, but it's also my job. Special Warfare Command sent me here to evaluate whether this program maintains the integrity standards required for integration into special operations training. My evaluation is that it fails completely. And if the response to that evaluation is to minimize, to contain, to make this about individual bad actors rather than systemic problems, then my next step is to take this documentation to the Inspector General's office, to congressional oversight committees, and to whatever journalists are interested in the story of how the military protects its reputation at the expense of its people. The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Major Torres was recalculating legal strategies behind his carefully neutral expression. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford studied Elena with something that might have been respect or might have been wariness. Colonel Hendricks leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would define the rest of her career. Sergeant Cross, I'm going to be very direct with you. What you're describing would require me to suspend this entire program, to initiate investigations into multiple officers, including some on my personal staff, and to acknowledge institutional failures that will reflect poorly on my command. Do you understand what you're asking? Yes, ma'am, I'm asking you to do the right thing even when it's hard. The same thing we ask of every recruit who enters military service. Hendricks held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Master Chief Webb, your assessment? Webb's response was immediate and uncompromising. Sergeant Cross is one of the most disciplined operators I've trained in 30 years. She endured 12 days of systematic harassment without breaking protocol once. She absorbed a 3-on-1 assault for 90 seconds to ensure her attackers revealed the full extent of their intentions before responding. She neutralized all three in less than 5 seconds, using precisely controlled force that prevented serious injury despite having legal justification for more aggressive action. She documented everything with professional thoroughness. And she's now giving this command the opportunity to reform itself before external oversight forces that reform. In my professional opinion, Colonel, you should take that opportunity. Hendricks nodded again, this time with something that looked like resignation or possibly relief. All right, here's what's going to happen. This program is suspended effective immediately pending comprehensive review. All recruits will be reassigned to alternative training tracks. All supervising officers will be subject to Inspector General investigation. Lieutenant Crane, Corporal Hunter, and Sergeant Voss will face full court-martial on all charges. And Sergeant Cross, you will present your complete findings to a special review board that includes representatives from Special Warfare Command JAG and congressional oversight. Is that acceptable? Elena felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. Not victory, not yet, but acknowledgement. The first step toward actual change. Yes, ma'am, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Sergeant. You've just made a lot of very powerful people very uncomfortable. That doesn't always end well for the whistleblower. I understand, ma'am, but my father taught me that doing the right thing isn't about calculating whether it ends well. It's about whether you can live with yourself afterward. Hendricks' expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your father would be proud of you. I hope so, ma'am. The meeting concluded with logistics and scheduling. The court-martial would be convened within 72 hours, unusually fast, but justified by the presence of clear evidence and federal evaluator status. Elena would have 24 hours to prepare her formal testimony. As they left Hendricks' office, Webb placed a hand briefly on Elena's shoulder. The gesture was professional appropriate, but carried weight beyond words. Acknowledgement of what she'd accomplished. Pride in what she'd endured. Recognition that the hardest part was still ahead. The court-martial convened 3 days later in a conference room converted into an impromptu military tribunal. The proceedings were closed to the public, but attended by enough senior officers to make the stakes clear. This wasn't just about 3 individuals. It was about whether the military would hold itself accountable or protect its own. Elena sat in the witness chair wearing her dress uniform, her posture correct, her voice steady as she walked the tribunal through every documented incident. 47 separate violations presented with timestamps and factual descriptions, devoid of emotion or embellishment. Marcus Crane's defense attorney, a competent JAG captain named Reynolds, tried to establish that his client hadn't known Elena was an evaluator. Sergeant Cross, when Lieutenant Crane approached you outside the library on day 11, did you identify yourself as a federal evaluator? No, sir. So he had no way of knowing that his actions constituted assault on a federal officer. His actions constituted assault on another service member, sir. My status as an evaluator is relevant to federal charges, but the fundamental crime would be the same regardless of who I was. Reynolds tried a different angle. You're trained in advanced combat techniques by Master Chief Webb. Isn't it true that you could have ended the confrontation at any time during those 90 seconds of alleged assault? Yes, sir. Then why didn't you? Elena looked directly at Crane, who sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had on the training field. Because I needed to give them every opportunity to stop themselves, sir. If I'd retaliated after the first strike, the defense could argue I overreacted. But 90 seconds of sustained assault, that's not a misunderstanding. That's attempted destruction. Objection, Reynolds said. Speculative language. Sustained, the presiding officer ruled. But Elena could see the impact on the tribunal members' faces. They understood what she was really saying. Jax Hunter's defense was more straightforward. He claimed he'd been following Crane's lead, that he'd been caught up in group dynamics, that he regretted his actions. His attorney presented his difficult childhood, his attempts to escape poverty through military service, his clean record prior to this incident. Elena felt something shift in her chest when Hunter took the stand. She saw not just the person who'd twisted her arm and struck her repeatedly, but the scared kid from a Rust Belt town who'd never learned healthy ways to prove his worth. When asked if she had any statement regarding Hunter's sentencing, she surprised everyone. Corporal Hunter made terrible choices, but I believe people can change if given the opportunity and the right guidance. He needs consequences for what he did, but he also needs a chance to rebuild his honor through service. Just not in combat roles. Not until he's proven he understands what discipline actually means. Hunter's attorney looked shocked. The tribunal members exchanged glances. Webb, sitting in the observer section, showed no reaction, but Elena knew he understood. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was the hardest form of strength. Kalavos's testimony was the most difficult to hear. She'd been a victim of the same toxic culture she'd perpetuated. She'd learned to survive by becoming harder, meaner, more vicious than her male counterparts. She'd internalized the poison and spread it to other women. When Voss took the stand, her voice was hollow. I saw Sergeant Cross, and I saw everything I'd forced myself to stop being. I hated her for it. I hated that she could be quiet and still be strong. I thought I had to be loud to matter. Elena listened to this confession and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but recognition of how systems break people and then weaponize that brokenness against others. During her impact statement, Elena addressed Voss directly. You became what you thought you needed to be to survive. I understand that, but you had a choice when you saw me being targeted. You could have remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable and protected me. Instead, you became another attacker. That was your choice, and choices have consequences. She paused, then added, but you also have time to make different choices, to unbecome what you hate. I hope you take that opportunity. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdicts were unanimous. Marcus Quintin, dishonorable discharge, reduction to lowest rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, 6 months confinement. His father's political intervention attempts had been documented and would be referred to Senate Ethics Committee. Jax Hunter, dishonorable discharge, reduction to lowest rank, forfeiture of pay, 3 months confinement with recommendation for alternative service opportunity in humanitarian logistics after completion of sentence and mandatory counseling. Kayla Voss, dishonorable discharge, reduction to lowest rank, forfeiture of pay, 4 months confinement with recommendation for counseling and potential reinstatement to non-combat support roles, pending psychological evaluation and demonstrated behavioral change. The sentences were severe, but included pathways to partial redemption for Hunter and Voss. Not forgiveness, but opportunity. Elena sat through the reading of verdicts with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished and what it had cost. 3 careers ended, multiple officers under investigation, an entire program suspended. And all because she'd refused to accept that harassment was just part of the culture. After the tribunal concluded that Senator William Crane attempted one final maneuver. He arrived at Camp Prescott with congressional staffers and media contacts prepared to argue that his son had been railroaded by overzealous prosecutors. He made it exactly as far as the base commander's office before Webb intercepted him. What happened in that office was never officially recorded, but 3 witnesses reported hearing Webb's voice through the closed door, delivering what one described as the most devastating verbal destruction I've ever witnessed. When Senator Crane emerged 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged a decade. He made no statement to the media, withdrew his political pressure, and within a month announced he wouldn't be seeking re-election. Years later, it would emerge that Webb had played a recording of the senator attempting to pressure Colonel Hendricks to minimize charges against his son. That recording, combined with documentation of other instances where the senator had used his position to protect his son from consequences, effectively ended his political career on the spot. Elena learned about this 3 days after the tribunal when Webb handed her a flash drive containing the audio file. Your father died because people with power protected their own interests instead of doing what was right, Webb said. I made sure that didn't happen this time. Elena listened to the recording once, heard the senator's voice shift from cordial to threatening when Hendricks refused to compromise the investigation, heard Webb enter the conversation and systematically dismantle every argument, every threat, every attempt at manipulation. When it finished, she looked at Webb with new understanding. You could have used this earlier, could have stopped him before the tribunal. Yes, but you needed to win on the merits of your case, not because I had leverage over his father. You needed to prove that justice could work without political intervention. The recording was insurance, to make sure that even if you won, he couldn't undo it afterward. Elena ejected the flash drive, handed it back. What happens to it now? That depends on the senator. If he stays quiet and accepts what happened, it stays confidential. If he tries to retaliate against you or anyone else involved in this case, it goes to every major news outlet in Washington. That's strategic, Webb finished. Your father taught you that warriors respond, not react. This is response, making sure the people who enabled this culture face consequences proportional to their actions. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the lesson underneath the tactic. Justice wasn't just about punishing the obvious offenders. It was about dismantling the systems that protected them. 2 weeks after the tribunal, Elena stood once again at the fence line watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and blood. But this time she wasn't alone. 15 female recruits from the suspended program had requested to meet with her to hear her story, to understand how she'd survived and what came next. She told them about her father, about the training with Webb, about the strategic patience that looked like weakness, but was actually the hardest form of strength, about documentation and evidence, and refusing to let systems silence truth. You're going to face resistance, one recruit said. A young woman named Private Jessica Lynn, 21 years old, with fierce determination in her eyes. People who think you made things worse by speaking up. Yes, Elena agreed. Some people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But the military can't be excellent if it protects mediocrity and toxicity. Real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about having the discipline to do what's right even when it costs you everything. What if we're not strong enough? Another recruit asked. Elena looked at the 15 faces surrounding her, saw her own fear and determination reflected back, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not just vindication or satisfaction, but purpose. You're stronger than you know, all of you. You survived a program designed to break you. You're still here. That means you already have what it takes. Now you just need to decide whether you're going to use that strength to perpetuate old patterns or create new ones. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Elena realized something that Webb had probably understood from the beginning. This mission had never been just about exposing 3 people or reforming one program. It had been about creating a new model, proof that you could be disciplined without being brutal, strong without being dominating, successful without sacrificing integrity. Her father had tried to create that model and paid with his life. She'd survived to finish what he started. And now these 15 recruits would carry it forward, multiplying the impact exponentially. The quiet ones weren't weak. They were just waiting for the right moment to change everything. And that moment had finally arrived. 6 months passed like water wearing down stone. Slow, inevitable, transformative. Camp Prescott looked the same from a distance. Same desert landscape. Same training facilities. Same perimeter fence marking the boundary between military discipline and civilian chaos. But beneath the surface, everything had changed in ways both subtle and seismic. The Special Operations Integration Program had been restructured from foundation to execution. New protocols, new oversight committees, new emphasis on psychological safety alongside physical rigor, and most significantly, new leadership. Colonel Sarah Hendricks had survived the investigation intact. Her decision to suspend the program and support Elena's testimony viewed as evidence of integrity rather than weakness. She'd been promoted to oversight of all special warfare training facilities in the Southwest region. Captain Morrison had been reassigned to a logistics position in Kansas, his career effectively stalled at its current rank for the foreseeable future. 4 other supervising officers had received formal reprimands and mandatory retraining in leadership ethics. And Sergeant Elena Cross, at 22 years old, had become the youngest senior combat instructor in the program's history. She stood now in the early morning darkness, watching the first class of recruits under the reform program complete their pre-dawn run. 47 faces, male and female, moving in formation with synchronized breathing and controlled pace. Not because they feared punishment, but because they understood that discipline was the foundation of excellence. Master Chief Roland Webb stood beside her, his presence a constant reminder of where she'd come from and what she represented. He'd transitioned from guest evaluator to permanent cultural advisor, a position created specifically to ensure that the lessons learned over those brutal 12 days became institutional memory rather than forgotten scandal. "They look good," Webb said quietly, his voice carrying approval. "They're learning," Elena agreed. "But learning is easy when the culture supports it. The real test comes when they face pressure to revert to old patterns. That's why you're here, to make sure they don't." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle across her shoulders like body armor. Heavy, but necessary. The price of change was eternal vigilance, her father had told her once during a camping trip, when she was 15 and frustrated that adults seemed to repeat the same mistakes despite knowing better. "People don't change because they learn," he'd explained, while they watched a fire burn down to embers. "They change because someone holds them accountable long enough for new patterns to become habit. That's leadership, not inspiring speeches, just consistent accountability until excellence becomes normal." She'd remembered those words during the darkest moments of her 12 days as bait, when staying silent felt impossible and fighting back felt necessary. Her father's voice in her memory reminding her that real change required endurance beyond individual moments. Now she was the one responsible for making sure that endurance translated into institutional transformation. The recruits completed their run and assembled for morning formation. Elena walked to the front of the group, her posture correct, her voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "Good morning." "Good morning, Sergeant Cross," they responded in unison. "Today marks week 6 of this training cycle. You're halfway through the program. Some of you are wondering if the intensity will increase. The answer is yes. Some of you are hoping it gets easier. The answer is no. But what will change is your capacity to handle difficulty. That's what training does. It doesn't make challenges disappear. It makes you capable of meeting them." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Saw determination, saw exhaustion, saw the same mixture of fear and resolve she'd felt standing in this exact spot 6 months ago. This program was redesigned because the previous version confused brutality with strength, confused domination with leadership, confused silence with loyalty. Those confusions got people hurt, got careers destroyed, and ultimately got the entire program suspended because it failed to produce the kind of warriors our military actually needs. Elena gestured to Webb standing at the edge of formation. Master Chief Webb spent 30 years in naval special warfare. He's conducted operations in 17 countries. He's earned every medal for valor our military awards. And he'll tell you that the most dangerous operators aren't the loudest or the most aggressive. They're the most disciplined. The ones who can endure discomfort without losing focus. The ones who respond strategically rather than react emotionally. Webb stepped forward, his presence alone enough to straighten spines and sharpen attention. "Sergeant Cross is correct. In 3 decades of combat operations, I never lost a team member because they weren't aggressive enough. I lost people because they let ego override judgment, because they prioritized proving themselves over completing the mission, because they confused violence with effectiveness." He let that statement settle, then continued. "The warrior culture we're building here is based on a simple principle. Competence earns respect. Discipline enables competence. And integrity protects both. If you can internalize that principle, you'll succeed in this program and in whatever operations you are assigned to afterward. If you can't, you'll wash out. Not because we'll break you, but because you'll break yourself trying to be something other than disciplined. The formation stood silent processing. Elena could see the shift happening in real time. The mental recalibration from viewing training as a test of pain tolerance to understanding it as development of strategic capacity. Dismissed to breakfast formation, Elena said. Training resumes at 0800. The recruits dispersed with controlled urgency. As they moved toward the mess facility, one figure separated from the group and approached Elena with visible hesitation. Private Jessica Lynn, the recruit who'd spoken up during that sunset conversation 6 months ago. 21 years old, 5'4", with the kind of wiry strength that came from growing up helping her family run a ranch in Montana. She'd proven herself capable during the first 6 weeks, but Elena had noticed something in her eyes during the harder exercises. Recognition, the look of someone who'd faced harassment before and survived it. Sergeant Cross, may I speak with you? Of course, Private Lynn. Jessica glanced toward Webb, who took the cue and walked back toward the observation tower, giving them privacy while remaining visible enough to maintain propriety. I wanted to thank you, Jessica said quietly, for what you did, for speaking up. My older sister went through a training program 3 years ago. Different base, different command, but same culture. She reported harassment, and they dismissed her complaint. Told her she was too sensitive. She eventually left the military entirely. When I heard what you accomplished here, I decided to enlist, because you proved it was possible to change things. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, the ripple effects of standing up. The lives affected by decisions that had felt impossibly difficult in the moment, but had cascading consequences she'd never fully see. Your sister made the complaint, even though she knew it might cost her, Elena said. That took courage. The system failed her. I'm sorry that happened. She said to tell you thank you. She follows the reforms that came from your testimony. Says maybe the next generation won't have to choose between integrity and career. Maybe, Elena agreed, but only if people like you hold the line. I exposed problems. The tribunal issued consequences. The command implemented reforms. But culture changes one decision at a time, made by people who choose discipline over dominance even when no one's watching. That's on you now. On all of you. Jessica nodded with fierce determination. I won't let you down. Don't worry about letting me down. Worry about becoming the kind of warrior your sister needed when she was going through training. That's the standard. As Jessica returned to formation, Elena felt Webb's presence behind her. You're good at this, he said. At what? Leadership. Real leadership. The kind your father would have excelled at if he'd survived long enough to move into training command. Elena turned to face him, saw something in his expression she'd rarely seen before. Vulnerability. The weight of survivor's guilt that probably kept him awake some nights, wondering why he'd made it through 30 years when better operators like David Cross had died young. He did lead, Elena said softly. He led by example even when it cost him everything. And now we're finishing what he started. That's leadership too, the kind that transcends individual lifetimes. Webb nodded slowly, then changed the subject with the emotional efficiency of someone who'd spent decades compartmentalizing. The new class starts tomorrow. 53 recruits. Command wants you to address them on day one. Set the tone, says someone. What should I tell them? The truth, that this program will test them in ways they're not expecting. That strength isn't about domination. That we're looking for warriors who can think strategically under pressure. That silence isn't weakness and patience isn't fear. The same things you taught me. The same things your father taught me, Webb gristed. I'm just passing it forward. The next morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that makes promises feel possible. Elena stood before 53 new recruits, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and terror that comes with starting something that might destroy you or transform you, or possibly both. She didn't give them an inspiring speech. Instead, she told them a story. 3 years ago, my father was killed in Afghanistan. He was a SEAL operator, one of the best, according to the people who served with him. He died because his unit was sent into an ambush based on faulty intelligence that no one questioned because the culture discouraged questioning authority. She let that statement land, saw the recruits process what it meant. Before he died, he filed complaints about the toxic leadership in his unit, about the culture that valued ego over analysis, about the officers who confused aggression with competence. His complaints were ignored, and 3 weeks later, he was dead, along with 4 other operators who trusted that leadership would protect them. Elena walked slowly along the front rank, making eye contact with individual recruits. I joined the military to finish what he started, to prove that you could maintain discipline without brutality, that you could be strong without being dominating, that institutional culture could change if people were willing to endure the cost of changing it. She stopped walking, stood at attention, her voice carrying absolute certainty. 6 months ago, I went through this program as an evaluator. I was harassed for 12 days by 3 people who thought quiet meant weak, who thought patience meant fear, who thought they could assault me without consequences because that's what the culture had taught them was acceptable. The silence was absolute. Every recruit knew the story. It had become legend, repeated in barracks and training facilities across every military installation. But hearing it directly from Elena transformed it from story to testimony. I endured 90 seconds of 3-on-1 assault before neutralizing all 3 attackers in less than 5 seconds. Not because I needed 90 seconds to figure out how to fight back, but because I needed to give them every opportunity to reveal who they actually were, to document their choices, to build a case that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Elena's voice hardened slightly. That experience resulted in court-martials, dishonorable discharges, and this program being completely restructured. It also resulted in me becoming the youngest senior combat instructor in program history, not because I was the strongest or the fastest or the most aggressive, but because I demonstrated discipline under conditions designed to break it. She scanned the assembled faces, saw the impact of her words settling into their understanding of what they'd signed up for. This program will test you. It will hurt. You will want to quit. You will face situations that seem impossible. And the difference between people who graduate and people who wash out won't be physical capacity. It'll be whether you can maintain discipline when every instinct screams to react emotionally. Elena's voice softened slightly, became almost gentle. I'm not here to break you. I'm here to build you into the kind of warriors our military actually needs. The kind who can endure discomfort without losing focus, who can face harassment without perpetuating it, who can be strong without needing to dominate, who understand that real power is having the capacity for violence, but the discipline to use it only when necessary. She stepped back, came to attention. That's the standard. If you can meet it, you'll succeed here and everywhere else the military sends you. If you can't, you'll discover that quickly and will help you find a better path. Either way, you'll learn something about yourself that you didn't know before you arrived. Dismissed to first training rotation. The recruits moved out with visible determination. Elena watched them go, feeling the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of purpose balanced in equal measure. The weeks that followed established new patterns. Training that was rigorous without being brutal. Discipline that was demanding without being demeaning. A culture where asking questions was encouraged and admitting limitations was viewed as strategic awareness rather than weakness. Elena ran morning formations, supervised combat drills, conducted after-action reviews that focused on decision-making process rather than just outcomes. And most importantly, she watched, constantly vigilant for signs that old patterns were trying to reassert themselves under the pressure of difficult training. 3 weeks into the new cycle, she noticed something that made her instincts flare. A recruit named Corporal Mike Dawson, 25 years old with prior enlisted experience, had started making comments about one of the female recruits. Nothing overtly harassing, just subtle digs about her pace during runs, jokes about her strength during equipment carries. The kind of low-grade toxicity that could metastasize into something worse if left unchecked. Elena didn't wait for it to escalate. She pulled Dawson aside after evening formation, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Corporal Dawson, I've noticed you making repeated comments about Private Rodriguez's performance. Would you like to explain your assessment? Dawson shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be called out. Just observation, Sergeant. She's struggling with some of the physical requirements. Is she meeting the minimum standards for her training phase? Well, yes, but then your observations are irrelevant unless you're offering constructive assistance. Are you offering to help Private Rodriguez improve her performance? Dawson hesitated, trapped by the logic. I guess I could. You guess or you will. I will, Sergeant. Good. You're now responsible for partnering with Private Rodriguez during strength training sessions. You'll help her develop techniques to maximize her efficiency. And Corporal Dawson, if I hear one more comment that sounds like you're undermining her confidence rather than building her competence, you'll be running remedial ethics training with Master Chief Webb. And I promise you that experience will be significantly more uncomfortable than just being a decent teammate. Clear, Bush. Crystal clear, Sergeant. Elena watched Dawson walk away, knowing that this small intervention might seem insignificant, but was actually critical. Cultural change happened in these micro-moments, when someone tested boundaries and found them firmly maintained. When behavior that might have been tolerated under the old system got immediate correction under the new one. 2 weeks later, she observed Dawson actually helping Rodriguez perfect her deadlift form, offering genuine encouragement, celebrating when she hit a new personal record. The transformation from subtle bully to supportive teammate hadn't required dramatic intervention, just consistent accountability and clear expectations. That was the lesson Elena was learning about leadership. It wasn't about grand gestures or inspiring speeches. It was about noticing the small things and addressing them before they became big things. About holding the line day after day until new patterns became automatic. But not every story had such straightforward resolution. 4 months into her role as senior combat instructor, Elena received a message that stopped her mid-stride as she crossed the training field. Marcus Crane was requesting permission to visit Camp Prescott. She read the formal request twice, feeling multiple emotions cascade through her chest. Surprise, wariness, curiosity, and underneath it all, something that might have been compassion or might have been the understanding that people were more than their worst moments. Crane had served his 6-month confinement, had been dishonorably discharged, had lost everything that had defined his identity since childhood. According to the request, he was now working as a civilian contractor in humanitarian logistics, helping coordinate supply chains for disaster relief operations. He wanted to observe her training methods, to understand what honor actually looked like when it wasn't tied to dominance and privilege. Elena took the request to Webb, who read it without visible reaction. "What do you think?" she asked. Webb was silent for a long moment, then handed the paper back. "I think people deserve the opportunity to become better than they were, but only if they've actually done the work of changing rather than just saying the right words. You'll know within 5 minutes of talking to him which one applies. And if he hasn't changed, then you deny the request and he learns that consequences include losing access to communities you have harmed. But if he has changed, if he's genuinely trying to rebuild himself into someone worthy of respect, then letting him observe might help him complete that transformation. Your call." Elena approved the request with conditions: 1-day observation, no direct interaction with recruits, supervised at all times, and the understanding that any behavior that undermined the program's culture would result in immediate removal and a restraining order. Marcus Crane arrived on a Thursday morning, and Elena almost didn't recognize him. The arrogant swagger was gone. The military bearing had been replaced with something more tentative. He'd lost weight, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Most significantly, his eyes were different, less certain, more aware of consequences. He wore civilian clothes, stood at a respectful distance, and waited for Elena to approach rather than assuming he could enter her space. "Sergeant Cross," he said quietly, "thank you for allowing this." "You have 4 hours, Mr. Crane. Use them wisely." She led him to the observation tower where Webb was already positioned. Crane climbed the stairs without complaint, took a seat in the corner, and watched the morning training rotation with complete attention and zero commentary. Elena ran the recruits through close quarters combat drills, demonstrating techniques, correcting form, emphasizing control over aggression. She watched Crane watching, trying to assess whether he was actually learning or just performing contrition. During a break between rotations, Crane spoke for the first time. "May I ask a question, Sergeant?" Elena nodded. "How do you maintain discipline without using fear?" "That's what I can't figure out. In my experience, people only followed orders because they were afraid of consequences." It was Elena realized a genuine question, not a challenge, not manipulation. Actual curiosity born from recognizing that his previous understanding had been catastrophically wrong. Fear is efficient short-term, she said, but it's expensive long-term. People who follow orders because they're afraid will execute tasks but won't think creatively, won't offer input that might contradict authority, won't take initiative when situations change unexpectedly. In combat, that rigidity gets people killed. She gestured toward the training field where recruits were helping each other adjust body armor between exercises. Discipline based on respect and competence creates different behavior. People follow orders because they trust that leadership has made the best decision possible with available information. They offer input because they know it'll be considered rather than dismissed. They take initiative because they understand the mission objective, even when specific orders can't cover every contingency. Crane watched the recruits for a long moment. My father led through fear. I thought that's what leadership was. Command and intimidation. I know, Elena said, that's what you learned. But learning something doesn't make it true. You had the opportunity to question whether that model actually worked. Instead, you perpetuated it. That was your choice. I made terrible choices, Crane said quietly. I hurt you. I damaged my own career. I disappointed everyone who'd invested in me. And the hardest part is knowing that I did all of that because I was too arrogant to question whether strength and domination were the same thing. Elena studied his face looking for signs of performance, found only genuine remorse and the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing hard internal work without knowing if it'll lead anywhere. What are you doing now? She asked. Working for a humanitarian logistics company. We coordinate supply chains for disaster relief. Food, water, medical supplies, temporary shelter. It's completely different from military operations, but the organizational principles are similar. I'm learning logistics, procurement, cross-cultural communication. He paused. I'm learning how to serve without needing to dominate. Do you like it? Crane considered the question carefully. I'm not sure like is the right word, but I respect it. I respect the people I work with who've dedicated their careers to helping rather than hurting. I respect that the measure of success is how many people get resources rather than how many enemies get eliminated. It's teaching me a different definition of strength. Webb, who'd been silent until now, spoke from his position near the window. Crane, you understand that nothing you do now changes what you did then. Yes, Chief, I understand that. I'm not trying to erase the past or earn forgiveness I don't deserve. I'm just trying to become someone who wouldn't make those choices again. Someone who understands that real honor comes from discipline and service, not from dominance and privilege. Webb nodded slowly. That's the right answer. Whether it's true will be determined by your actions over years, not by one conversation. I understand, Chief. The observation continued through afternoon training rotations. Elena watched Crane take notes, ask occasional questions that revealed he was actually analyzing the teaching methodology rather than just sitting through required time. When recruits struggled with techniques, she noticed him lean forward with genuine concern. When they succeeded, she caught the ghost of a smile. At the end of 4 hours, as the training day concluded and recruits moved toward evening formation, Crane stood and prepared to leave. He paused at the top of the observation tower stairs, turned back toward Elena. Sergeant Cross, I need to say something, and I need you to know I'm not asking for anything in return. No forgiveness, no absolution, nothing. Just acknowledgement that I'm saying it. Elena waited. What I did to you was unforgivable. I assaulted you. I abused the privilege of my rank and my father's position. I perpetuated exactly the kind of toxicity that gets people killed in combat zones. And the only reason I'm standing here now with any possibility of rebuilding my life is because you showed me mercy I didn't deserve. You could have asked for maximum sentences, could have ensured I spent years in military prison. Instead, you advocated for opportunities to demonstrate change. His voice was steady but carried weight. I think about that choice every single day, bro. About the discipline it took to respond with strategic mercy rather than emotional vengeance. About what it means that someone I hurt advocated for my rehabilitation. I don't understand it, but I'm grateful for it. And I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of that mercy. Elena held his gaze, saw a genuine transformation, or possibly the beginning of it. Saw someone who'd been broken down to foundation and was slowly rebuilding with better materials. Mr. Crane, here's what I need you to understand. I didn't show you mercy because you deserved it. I showed you mercy because our military needs to model the values it claims to uphold. Justice tempered with rehabilitation. Accountability paired with opportunity for growth. If we only punished without offering pathways to change, we'd be perpetuating the same cycle of toxicity that created the conditions for your behavior in the first place. She paused, then continued with absolute clarity. You made terrible choices. You faced severe consequences. Now you have the opportunity to make different choices. Whether you actually do that is entirely up to you, but know that your father's political career ended because he tried to shield you from consequences. You have a chance he didn't give himself. Don't waste it. Crane nodded, his expression suggesting he understood both the gift and the responsibility. I won't. Thank you, Sergeant. He descended the stairs and left the base without looking back. Webb moved beside Elena, both of them watching Crane's vehicle disappear into the desert distance. That was harder than the original confrontation, Webb observed. Yes, Elena agreed. Fighting him was easy. He was an enemy. Offering him a path to redemption while knowing he might waste it, that requires a different kind of courage. Your father would have done the same thing. He believed people could change if properly motivated. And he died because toxic leadership proved him wrong. No, Webb corrected gently. He died because he stood up to toxic leadership and they eliminated him rather than changing. But that doesn't mean change is impossible, just that it requires people willing to keep pushing even when progress is slow and costly. Elena nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle into her bones. Change was possible. She'd proven it. This reformed program proved it. The dozens of recruits learning new patterns proved it. Even Marcus Crane attempting rehabilitation proved it. But change was also fragile, required constant vigilance, demanded that people hold the line day after day, moment after moment, refusing to let old patterns reassert themselves through complacency or exhaustion. That night, as sunset painted the desert in familiar shades of amber and blood, Elena walked to the perimeter fence where she'd stood countless times before. But this time, 15 recruits weren't waiting for guidance. This time, Webb wasn't offering lessons about strategic patience. This time, she was alone with the ghost of her father and the weight of everything she'd accomplished in his name. She pulled out her phone, open to a photo she'd carried for 3 years. Her father in dress blues, standing at attention, his face showing the same fierce determination she saw in the mirror every morning. Underneath the photo, she'd transcribed the last words he'd sent her before his final mission. Elena, if you're reading this, something went wrong, but I need you to know that I don't regret speaking up about the problems in my unit. Some things are worth the cost. Honor isn't about surviving. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself, even when it might destroy you. I love you. Be brave, be disciplined, and never let anyone convince you that silence is safer than truth. Elena had read those words 1,000 times, had drawn strength from them during the 12 days of harassment, had remembered them during the 90 seconds of assault, had clung to them during testimony and tribunal, and the lonely nights afterward when she wondered if burning down an entire program's reputation had been worth the cost. Now standing in the cooling desert evening, with 6 months of successful reform behind her and decades of vigilance ahead, she finally understood what her father had actually been trying to tell her. It wasn't that speaking up guaranteed success. It was that staying silent guaranteed failure. It wasn't that individual courage could fix systemic problems. It was that systemic change became possible only when individuals refused to accept toxic culture as inevitable. It wasn't that her father's death had meaning because she'd avenged it. It was that his death had meaning because she'd transformed his sacrifice into institutional change that would outlive them both. She typed a message she knew he'd never read but needed to send anyway. Dad, I finished what you started. The program is reformed. The culture is changing. And I'm teaching the next generation that warriors don't prove themselves through domination. They prove themselves through discipline. through strategic patience, through having the strength to show mercy when vengeance would be easier. I hope you're proud. I hope wherever you are, you know that your sacrifice wasn't wasted. I love you. Your daughter, the warrior you trained me to be. She hit send knowing the message would bounce back undeliverable, but feeling lighter for having written it anyway. Behind her, footsteps approached. Elena turned to find Jessica Lynn, the recruit whose sister had been driven from military service 3 years ago by toxic culture Elena had helped dismantle. Sergeant Cross, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted you to know that my sister called today. She's re-enlisting. Said the reforms that came from your testimony convinced her that the military might actually deserve people who care about integrity. She's going through the new program starting next month. Elena felt something break open in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the recognition that suffering transformed into purpose had value beyond immediate outcomes. That standing up created ripples she'd never fully see, but could trust were spreading outward, touching lives, changing trajectories, making the world incrementally better in ways both small and immeasurable. That's good news, Private Lynn. I look forward to training with your sister. She said to tell you thank you for proving it was possible to change things. Elena shook her head gently. I didn't prove it was possible. Your sister proved it was necessary when she made her complaint, despite knowing the cost. I just proved that persistence eventually overcomes resistance. Tell her, welcome back. Tell her we're building the military she deserved the first time. Jessica saluted and walked back toward the barracks, leaving Elena alone again, with the desert and the stars and the weight of legacy that felt less like burden and more like purpose with each passing day. The next morning, she stood before her recruits for the daily formation and felt something shift in how she understood her role. She wasn't just a combat instructor. She was a cultural guardian, a living reminder that discipline and compassion weren't opposites but partners. That strength without integrity was just violence with better uniforms. Good morning, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled formation. Good morning, Sergeant Cross, they responded. Today, we're going to talk about legacy, about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself, about why the choices you make during training will define not just your career, but the culture of the military for the next generation. She paused, scanning the faces before her, saw the same mixture of determination and uncertainty she'd carried at their age, saw potential waiting to be properly channeled. My father died because toxic leadership valued ego over analysis. I joined the military to prove that his death didn't have to be meaningless, that institutional culture could change if people were willing to pay the cost of changing it. 6 months ago, I paid that cost. Got harassed, got assaulted, got hurt in ways that still ache when the temperature drops. Elena's voice remained steady, factual, devoid of self-pity. But that cost produced reform, new protocols, new oversight, new emphasis on discipline over domination. And now I'm teaching you the same lessons Master Chief Webb taught me, that warriors aren't defined by aggression, but by control. That real strength is having the capacity for violence, but the discipline to use it only when necessary. That honor means standing up even when silence would be safer. She stepped forward slightly. You're going to face moments where old patterns try to reassert themselves, where someone suggests that hazing builds character, or that harassment is just part of military culture, or that speaking up makes you weak. In those moments, remember this conversation. Remember that culture changes one decision at a time. Remember that you have the power to either perpetuate toxicity or replace it with excellence. The formation stood silent, absorbing the weight of what she was actually saying, that they weren't just learning combat techniques, they were inheriting responsibility for the soul of military culture itself. Dismissed to first training rotation. Make your choices count. As the recruits dispersed, Webb approached with something in his hand, an envelope official military stationery addressed to Sergeant Elena Cross. This arrived this morning from Special Warfare Command. Elena opened it carefully, read the brief letter inside, then read it again to make sure she'd understood correctly. She'd been selected for promotion to warrant officer, the youngest person in program history to receive the recommendation. Effective immediately, she'd be transitioning from instructor to curriculum development responsible for ensuring that the reforms implemented at Camp Prescott became standard across all special warfare training facilities. Her father's sacrifice, her strategic endurance, the painful 12 days, the tribunal, the 6 months of rebuilding culture one interaction at a time, all of it had been leading to this moment, this opportunity to transform isolated reform into systemic change, to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she documented in her leather journal. Elena looked up at Webb, saw pride radiating from his weathered face. "You earned this," he said simply. "Your father would be proud. Hell, I'm proud. You took his sacrifice and turned it into something that will outlive us both." "We did," Elena corrected. "You trained me. You supported me. You held the line with me." Webb shook his head. "I taught you techniques. You figured out how to use them to change the world. That was all you." They stood together, watching the morning sun climb higher, burning away the last traces of desert chill, illuminating the training field, where 47 recruits were learning that silence wasn't weakness and patience wasn't fear, and discipline was the foundation of every form of excellence. The quiet ones had spoken, and the entire military was learning to listen. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of military training culture in the mid-2020s, they would point to multiple factors: policy changes, leadership transitions, generational shifts in values and expectations. But people who'd actually lived through the changes knew the truth. It had started with one woman who'd endured 90 seconds of assault without breaking, who'd documented 47 incidents when staying silent would have been easier, who'd stood in front of a tribunal and refused to let her father's sacrifice be meaningless. One woman who'd proven that the quiet ones weren't weak. They were just dangerous in ways that changed everything. On a training field in the Arizona desert, recruits were learning a lesson that would echo through generations. That silence wasn't weakness. That patience wasn't fear. That the quiet ones were the most dangerous of all. And at Arlington National Cemetery near Section 60, the wind moved through oak trees where a SEAL operator had been laid to rest 3 years before. On his headstone, someone had placed a small medal, recent, still gleaming. The inscription beneath it, written in careful handwriting, read, "Mission complete, Dad. The quiet ones won." Elena Cross had kept her promise. And David Cross could finally rest.